Hi everybody and welcome to CAD-Prof.com. This is lesson 8 of a 10-part series, Landscape for CAD. You'll notice with this lesson you have two PDF files, and I'm just going to open them momentarily here to take a quick look at them. We have an L2 drawing and an L3 drawing. L2 shows the sectional view of the project that we're working on, as well as a detail of the finial. And L3 shows the actual section of the drawing as well as some support brackets. And please, again, print these off so we'll be referring to them later on in the project. I'm going to launch CAD. Last day we left off with lesson 7. So I'm going to go into lesson 7 L1. It's already listed here on my window. And you'll notice I didn't quite finish off last day. The pickets that we were working on, the right half was already stretched down and the left half we hadn't completed. Let me just open up to full screen, maximize my view area, and I'm going to roll my mouse to zoom in. We'll continue stretching this project as a bit of a review. Stretch is one of those commands you have to practice time and time again in order to make sure that you understand exactly what you're doing. I'm going to stretch the remainder of these pickets so that we can move on to the next portion of the program. I'm zooming in when I can't completely view the image clearly without risking or hitting another part of the drawing, so I'm zooming in very tightly for that. Then I roll my mouse out, I'll roll that a bit far, and then roll it back in. This one required me to stretch beyond the intersection of the arc, and then I could stretch it back down to the arc. Okay, the arc was simply a construction line, so we'll get rid of that. So what we're going to do is we're going to draw the finial that's on the picket. We're only going to create one, group it, and then copy it to all the other locations. To draw the finial, I'm going to create a very small construction grid to help me with that. So I'm going to go into my construction layer. This time I'm just going to use the line command because the actual grid itself is not all that large, and the construction lines, as you know, they just go on forever, so it get really confusing. So when we take a look at L2, you'll notice that there's a number of dimensions above the object as well as to the right. I'm going to use that and create a construction grid. So the ones above have a common denominator of a 1/4 inch. So I'm going to use offset, type in 0.25, and offset a 1/4 inch values, and this will give me a sense of the scale of the object as well. And you can see I can zoom in just a bit tighter. Now the dimensions in the other way are again offset at a 1/4 inch, so I'm not clicking on any command. I'm just going to repeat my 1/4 inch values, and I have 3 and then 3 more. Along the horizontal lines, you'll notice I have a dimension of 3/4 inch, so I'm going to remove 2 of them that are not necessary. There's my 3/4 inch value. Then I have the 1/2 inch value, so I'm going to remove that one, and then I've got my 1/4 inch base for the finial. So now I'm ready to draw it. I'm going to move from my construction line layer to my fence layer, and I'm going to draw the object. So the first thing I'm going to do is draw the actual finial cross that will go from top to bottom and from side to side. And as we work through these projects, you'll find that you're learning more and more about the commands. In this particular instance, we're going to be drawing arcs. And what do we know about the arcs? They have a radius of 1. So I know the start point, I know the end point, and I know the radius, and that's this arc command right here. So I know the start, I know the end, and I know the radius. Now, what I have to understand is that arcs are thought of in counterclockwise direction. So the actual start point is here if the end point is there. So I'm going to click on my left portion of the arc, then the top portion, and then as I move my mouse out, I'm going to type in 1 and enter, and there's my arc. I'm going to do the same in the next one. So arc, start and radius. I'm going to start at the top and go to the right side, move my mouse and type in 1. The only reason I'm moving my mouse is to see or confirm that the arc's in the right direction. So this one here, if I go in this direction, it's clockwise. That's incorrect. I've got to start at the bottom and go to the top. So I'm going to click on my arc command once again, start in radius, and I'm going to click on this part of my grid and go to the left and move over, type in 1 and enter. And then I'm going to draw my final arc starting at the outer edge and downwards, and I'll type in 1 and enter. Now you'll notice this one didn't work, and the reason was because I didn't go back to the arc command. It doesn't default to the selected item. So I'm going to select that and press delete, and then go to the arc command and click on start and radius. Start, N, move my mouse, 1 and enter, and there's my radius. Now I've got a cap down here, and you'll notice that it's 5/8 of an inch. It's out by 1/8 of an inch from our 1/4 inch grid. So by being 5/8, I've actually got to move it 1/16 of an inch on either side. So offset 1/16, enter. I'm going to click on the line in the side, the line and the side. I didn't draw that at first only because you can see with all the extra line work, it may have been confusing where we're going to draw our arcs. And now I'm going to draw the base of the object. I'm going to go into rectangle, and there's my rectangle for the base of the finial. It's completed. I don't need these construction lines anymore, so I'm going to delete them. And this object in here is made up of a number of components. I'm going to group these components together. So I'm putting a window around the entire finial. I'll right click on any one of those nodes, and you'll notice in this menu we have the option group. So where it says group, I'm going to select group, and now this is a single entity. If I click on any part of it, it highlights the entire object. I want to move this finial from the midpoint of the base of this to the midpoint of the top of each picket. So I'm going to check to see if my object snap is set to midpoint. It's not. I want to select midpoint, but I want to remove endpoint and intersection so it doesn't pick up some of those other points that are at the top of each of the pickets. Let's press escape, and now I'm going to move my first one from the midpoint of the bottom, make sure I'm on the first picket, I am, to the midpoint of the top of the picket. So let's repeat this process, only now with copy. So I'll select copy, put a window around the picket, and pick the base midpoint, and now just continuously click. I've left my F8 on so you can actually see it snapping to the midpoint. I'm going to pan right in the middle of the command and keep clicking on the top of each of these pickets until I've completed all of them. And now I've got my picket as an object that I'll be drawing in a separate window, or actually I'll be displaying in a separate window. When we drew these dimensions, we prepared these dimensions for a 1/2 inch scale. Now I need to prepare the picket dimensions to be a 2:1 scale. So in order to do this, I'm going to go into annotations and click on my dimension style icon. And this time with dim 24 selected, I'm going to click on new. And this one is the dim times 2. So dim x2 and select continue. So now I've got my dim times 2 menu. I only have to change one thing. When I go into the fit tab, notice how this says 24. That's because our scale is a 1/2 inch, or 1:24. This time it's 2:1. That's the equivalent of 1 to 1/2. So my overall scale here will be 0.5. So the 0.5 overall scale is for the dim times 2. Click on OK. There it is, dim times 2. Make sure it's current. So I set a current. Close my menu. Now what I want to do is make sure I'm actually going to be dimensioning in the right layer. So dim times 2 is the layer I want to be in. And now I'm ready to dimension my object. So let's start at the bottom and see how we can dimension these two items here. So I'll select linear, and I'm referring all of this from the L2 PDF. And notice it's looking for midpoint again. Okay, let's press escape, go back down into our snap settings, remove midpoint, and this time we're going to use intersection. We can put endpoint on as well. Click back onto our screen, and now we're ready to actually dimension the object once again. Linear, and I'll pick the base of the finial where it hits the post, and there is my dimension. Now I'm showing a horizontally stacked fraction. You'll notice in the actual diagram it's a diagonal stacking. So I'm going to go back into annotation and click on my dimension style manager. I'm going to go into my modify menu, and if I select the primary units tab, this is where we can adjust how our fractions look. So right now my fractional format is horizontal. I'm going to click on diagonal, and you can see the image has changed on display to a diagonal fraction. I'm going to select OK and close this menu, and now my fraction looks like the drawing. I'm going to add my next dimension. Now that second dimension is neither continuous nor is it baseline, but it is linear. So I will go up into the menu, select linear, click on the two locations that define the width of the base, and place it visually. So let's take a look at the right set and the top set of dimensions. I'm going to select linear, and the first dimension refers to the overall width, and I'm going to move my dimension line just so it's slightly above the top of the finial. And then I've got two series of continuous dimensions, so I'll go dimension continuous, and that refers to the 1/4 inch the base and the 1/4 inch on the side. Press enter. Now I'm going to go and select my baseline dimensioning, and then I'm going to type in S and enter, and click on the first line of the first dimension, and then I can do my overall, and it neatly places it exactly where it should. Let's do the same on the right side. Linear. Now you always start from one end and go to the other. You don't start in the middle, because then it doesn't work properly. So I'm going to select the top of the finial and the outer side and just move that down a bit. And this is a continuous dimension set. So that will refer to the 1/2 inch and the 1/4 inch dimension. Press enter. Select dimension, baseline, S and enter. Click on either the top one or the bottom one. It doesn't matter which one of these two extension lines you select, as long as it's the other extreme, and then press enter. Now all my dimensions are created. Alright, at this point we've finished dimensioning the finial. It's in the dim 2 setting. I'm going to zoom out, and if you take a look at L3, we got a lot of variations in how we're treating the cap and the post. I'm going to make a duplicate of this. I'm going to leave all the dimensions as they are for now and copy this entire view straight down. Typically you work on one object and adjust it unless there's some dramatic physical change, and there is in reference to the cap. This is where we're going to be showing the width of the elements within the column, as well as how the cap has changed. The actual stonework in here is 4 inches wide, so I'm going to use offset, type in 4 and enter. Click on the object, click on the side, click on the object, and click on the side. Where had I drawn this as a rectangle, this wouldn't have worked properly. The stonework is something that has variations of 3, 4, and 5 inch heights. So I can use this base, but then I'll have a repeated pattern on both sides. And just for the purposes of showing the contractor that it's not a repeated pattern, you don't want the left and the right side to look the same. So the first one I'm going to offset 4, just so I can have a line that I can then trim. So I will trim to these two edges, that line. The grout in this particular application is 3/8 of an inch. So I'll type in 3/8. And I will create the grout line. And this time I'm going to offset one side 3 and the other side 5. And then I will repeat the grout of 3/8 of an inch. I only have to do a couple of these, and then I can use the information that I already have there, and I will offset the next one 5 on the left side. So I have a 4 inch, a 3 inch, and a 5 inch. Here I've got a 4 inch, a 5 inch. I'm missing a 3. So offset that 3. And now I'm going to create my grouts, 3/8. Now I've got these two lined up again, which is not really problematic, but we try to avoid lining out the grout just to confirm with the contractor that this is a random installation. So now what I'm going to do to make this easier is copy the top group that I have a 3 and a 5 right above this one. I'm going to use this grout intersection point and place it there. And you can see now I've got a 4, 5, 3, 3, 5. So I'm going to create another 4 for this one. So I will copy these two right above there. I'm just trying to make sure I've got something that looks random. Now I'm going to copy this grouping here. And see how I'm avoiding the grout that's down below? Because I'm going to use that as my base point to copy on top of that point. There we go. That looks pretty random. And now I continue doing that until I get near the top. And doing that on the other side as well. Let's take this group here from that point over here. And then the top will be random size to allow me for the cap. You'll notice that the cap has a couple of dimensions. This is a 1/2 inch offset. Now let's say we did use the rectangle command to make this cap. There is a command that allows us to break up rectangles. It's called explode and allows us to break up polylines. I'm going to use this existing drawing and it's offset by a 1/2 inch. And you can see in the details of the cap, we've got a couple of 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch, 1/4 inch, and 1 inch overhang settings. I want to be able to use this line work, and I'm going to be copying this line work here from that point to that point to this point, and then use my trim command to trim all my line work. I just created a window. I'm going to trim that and that, that and that. I don't need this line in here because this is where the stonework comes up into this gap or into this space. But what I will do is this. I will copy this line. I want to show that there is going to be some grout at the top of each of the stone edges right to the underside of the cap. So now I'm going to extend to the underside of the cap both stones. And then I'm going to copy this grout. And again, gnome point to gnome point. I have an intersection here. I'm going to click on the intersection there. And that represents the little bit of grout that will hold the cap in place. Now in sectional view, I don't have this line. I'll delete it. And I've got two circles. These are our drip cuts. They're 1/2 inch in diameter. So I'll select circle. Doesn't matter what layer I'm in. I can always change that later. We haven't done this, so let's try it. I'm going to pick center diameter because I know the diameter is 1/2 inch. I'm going to pick the midpoint of this line. Now, remember I removed midpoint, so I'm going to use a snap override, shift right mouse key, midpoint, click on the midpoint of that line, and it is a 1/2 inch diameter, so I type in 0.5. Now it's in completely the wrong layer, but I want to demonstrate this anyways, so that if this happens, you don't redo everything and you just switch the layer properties. I'm going to complete my trimming of the circle and the line. I use the crossing to select everything and a crossing to cut the two pieces. Now I press escape. That half arc is in the wrong layer, so I selected it and then I go into the layer property menu, and right here I can switch to the cap, and now I have it. Okay, so rather than go through the whole process again, I can delete this line and then copy my work from the right side, from the endpoint of one to the endpoint of the other, and now I've drawn all the details for the cap in 1L3. I'll draw the actual brackets at a later time, but I want to demonstrate how we do multiple viewports. So I've got my two drawings. I've done a bit of work here, so let's save the file. I'm going to select File, Save as, and I'm going to put it in my Lesson 8 folder. So I'm going to go up into the primary directory, double click Lesson 8, and save it in the appropriate folder. Now I have two drawings. If I go into Layout 1, there is my title block along with the viewport. Now this viewport is active. See how it's a bold line? I'm going to double click outside of it, and now it's no longer active. That allows me to move it. So let's refresh this concept. If I double click inside the viewport, I'm changing the view, the zoom, how I see everything inside that viewport. If I double click outside the viewport, I'm now changing my view, my zoom on everything outside the viewport. So outside the viewport is paper space. That's what this symbol represents. When I double click inside the viewport, I get my X and Y axis. That's what it represents, the inside of the drawing. Do not draw in this viewport. If you draw in this viewport, it's very easy to get lost in space. So for instance, I'm going to double click outside the viewport, zoom into the viewport. Notice I can't see my title block. If I double click now, I'm in the viewport. See, it's X and Y. I can't exit this space. What I have to actually type in is PS for paper space, and then enter. When I enter, notice the symbol will change. Now I'm in paper space. It's very easy to get lost in these viewports. So I want to create L2, which is a slightly different visual. But notice now that my dimensioning of this picket, the actual finial above it, is there, and it's really tiny. Okay. In this viewport, in L1, I don't want to see these dimensions. So I'm going to double click inside the window. That's important. I'm going to go up into my Layers Manager, and I'm going to turn off the view of my dim X2. Not the flashlight, that turns it off everywhere in every viewport, but the one that has the little flashlight inside of a square. When I click on that, it turns it off in this viewport only. Now I'm going to double click outside my viewport and see it's off in L1. If I go to Model Space, it's still there. It's visible because my dim layer X2 is still on, but it's off in this viewport. Now we're going to create L2. The way we create L2 is by duplicating the L1 page and then naming it L2. Now you'll notice that the name of the tab is Layout 1. Double click on Layout 1 and you'll notice it's highlighted. Let's call that L1. And now we've renamed it. Click in the gray area or outside of the tab. Now what I want to do is copy L1. Right click on L1. Select the option Move or Copy. You'll get a menu that comes up that says, what do you want to do here? You want to move one of the layout tabs or copy it. I want to create a copy of L1. L1 is selected. I click on Create a Copy and select OK. So there's my duplicate. Now it just automatically names it with a bracketed name beside it. I'm going to change that to L2. So let's repeat the process. Double click on the label of the tab. Type in L2. Click off of that tab. Now it's wanting to select something, so I just press the escape to get out of it. There's my L2 tab. I want that tab to physically be positioned after L1. So I clicked and dragged that tab over. I am now looking at L2. It's identical to L1. They're the same. So why did we do this? Because we're going to create a viewport of the changes that we made. First of all, double click inside of the viewport. Now, this takes some coordination, but you'll get it after a while. So in the viewport, click on the wheel of your mouse and slide the drawing up and let it go. And this is displaying the actual section that we just drew. Now this may require some finessing and moving around a bit later on. That's okay. Now let's make sure that this is the right scale. If I look down here in my drawing aids, it still appears as a 1/2" scale because we copied the viewport. But now I want a viewport of the finial. So double click outside of the viewport. This I need to change its size. So while I'm in paper space, remember that's what this triangle represents, I can click on the viewport and actually click and drag the nodes so it displays only part of it. Notice I've shortened the window and it only displays part of the section of the drawing that we copied and pasted down below. Now in this portion here, I want to show the finial. Okay, the viewport is still selected. Press Escape. Now I'm going to switch to the viewport layer. And I'm going to create a new viewport. Again, we need to have the secondary menu, and we click on the word View. In here we select Viewports, one viewport. And here I'm going to click a viewport to represent a new window. It automatically selects everything on your page and creates that viewport representing, or a view representing, everything that's in model space. So if I want to zoom in on the finial, I have to be in the viewport. Remember, this symbol on the bottom left-hand corner represents the paper. So I'm working with the paper when I'm zooming in and out. If I want to zoom in and out in the viewport, I double-click inside the viewport. Now I have my X and Y symbol that identifies I'm in the viewport. So now I can roll the wheel of my mouse and zoom in on that finial. If I click and hold the wheel, I can pan that finial. I want it to a precise scale, and the scale I want is 2:1. So I'm going to type in Z, enter, and this time instead of 1 over something XP like we did for all the other scales, so half-inch scale we put in 1 over 24 XP, this one is 2:1. So we identify that by typing in 2 XP and press enter. There is my finial represented in the viewport at the correct scale. Now that will take some practice to get it the right size and then get it in the right position. And even while it's in here, I can click and hold my mouse to repan it into place. Just be careful not to roll it, because then you actually change the scale. How do you know if you got the right scale? Look at the drawing aids, and there it is. It shows you 2:1. Now I'm missing a couple radial dimensions here. So I'm going to go back into my model space drawing, and on that finial, I will look at dimensioning the two radial values. So switch back to dim X2, and under dimension we have an option here called radius. So I'm going to click on radius. I'm going to click on the arc approximately where I want it to dimension from, and I now have my radial dimension. If I zoom in on that, you'll notice that the R1 is in the wrong spot. So how do I move that radial dimension? If I click on it and I click on the node, it's not behaving the way I expected when I did a linear dimension. So this is the rare case where we have to select a manual position for our text. I'm going to go back into annotation and the dimension style manager and modify this. And in this menu under fit, I'm going to say place text manually. Now I don't want that continuously on, because if I do linear dimensions, I'd have to place each one of these texts after I dimension it. So it's only going to be a one-time event. I've changed it. I'm going to select close. Now it doesn't automatically update this. I have to redo that dimension. So I'm going to click on dimension and radius. And this time I'm going to pick the lower arc. And see how it allows me to move that radius. I don't want to get too close to the line because it'll break the line. It's one of the rules in dimensioning that the text has to be a certain distance above for a continuous line. So I want to place this one approximately here above. I'm going to take this dimension that I did earlier and delete it. And now I'll recreate that one correctly. Dimension, radius, click on the arc approximately where I want to position it. And then click the R1 and reposition it, making sure I don't break the dimension line. And now I'm happy with everything. So I want to go back into annotation, quickly change that back so I don't forget. And I want to remove the place text manually, select OK, and close the menu. And now I've got this dimension correctly. Now please make sure you're in model space, because if I'm in one of these viewports and I zoom out, I'm just zooming out within the viewport and I won't actually see the outer edge of it. But if I click on L2 and I did this all correctly, I should see my two new radius dimensions in the viewport. Everything looks fine. I'm going to double click outside of it, and that's how we'd create multiple pages with multiple viewports of our object. One last thing I'm going to show you is that if I actually turn off the viewports, it hides these blue lines that I've identified here only because it's in the viewport layer. And you can see that the viewports float on their own. If I want to create a border around the other, I have to take a different approach. What I actually do is create in my title block layer a rectangle that matches the viewport. So when I turn off my viewport layer, I have one object with a box around it and the other one free floating. Now the viewports are still there. If I double click inside of them, I can still move my objects around, but they're no longer scalable or resizable in this format. I must have the viewport visible in order to make it scalable or resizable. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's lesson. This requires a lot of practice. When we complete L1, L2, and L3 in model space, then we can create the 3 pages and finish up with the annotations. I look forward to seeing you the next day.